What is classical art to me?
I guess for me, classical art is really a way for the Greeks and Romans to distribute their stories in a way that everybody could see them.
The art they did produce, things like vases, bowls, frescoes, paintings, were usually designed to tell stories about places or about people.
It's fascinating, all the different stories that they tell just by their floors. So you can imagine what else their culture would have been like if their floors were telling and their walls were telling a story, what the people would have been like.
Being fascinated and pulled in by all of those pictures and not really necessarily understanding, the history of it, but just thinking everything was really neat.
Or it could have been something produced for religious purposes that in modern times we think looks nice, and so we call it art.
And then again, you can have mythology as well, such as the House of the Mysteries at Pompeii, which is a little creepy, but it is what it is.
Religious figures were used in a manner to worship or venerate their deities.
But the best ones are the ones that are mythology in theme, so we get a sense as to support of the text that we have for myths. So we learn more about that.
For instance, if you weren't literate, whether you be Greek or Roman, there was enough in the art for you to simply look at a mosaic or look at a sculpture, look at a tapestry, anything, and really get the story just from the image, which I think is great because it's accessible to everyone. Anyone recognizes the characters in the mythology or the characters.
And sort of high idealism of Attic art, the 5th century, where everything's so perfect, and then all the extreme emotion of Hellenistic art, and then a lot of bad Roman copies of stuff. So it's kind of a way of reinforcing this crazy thing that's Roman art.
Well, most of the time people think of the vases. However, I focus my attention on the other things that they would surround themselves in their homes because I'm big into culture. So one of my absolute favorite things would be mosaics and how they decorated their floors.
So, how did classical art influence art today? Ever since the Renaissance, I feel like there was a trend, at least up until very modern art. But for several hundred years, there was a trend towards realism, right, and capturing the human form as it actually looks.
You really think about it when you go to museums. Everyone's at the sculptures or whatnot, and you just walk by the mosaics, and you're like, oh, that's pretty cool. But then when you really get up close and look at each little tesserae is so small that it is a whole different perspective that a lot of people don't really think about.
And for me, I guess, my favorite kind of art, I love the kind of art that was outside the home. I love the mosaics. I love, for instance, any kind of signposts or anything, because really in the classical world, I think anything could be art. It wasn't simply just to decorate a house or to decorate any kind of palace or structure. Really, the signposts would be, I think, considered art.
What's powerful is how writing has continued to influence art. And so I think the most striking time I saw something that was contemporary but based on a classical image was this part of the Berlin Wall, and it was a picture of Daphne, but instead of Daphne springing into a laurel tree, she had barbed wire and everything coming out of her hands, and she was being entangled in all of this barbed wire and bleeding. And so it's sort of like how this history of the literature and the art comes into the modern world and gets used to sort of show in contemporary terms how that idealization has been undercut and destroyed. And a lot of that's to do with individual expression.
Is also somewhat an attempt of, for instance, the powers in Europe to recapture some of what made Rome so great, right? A lot of the powers in the Renaissance and afterwards, tried to use those same sorts of features, right? Once again, to sort of recall the greatness that classical Greece and Rome were.
And it's all art. Pretty much everything you look at, from the columns on the buildings to the signs outside that say "Beware of dog." Right? It was all classical art.